Good morning, Wise Tribe, and welcome to today's Anju Asks. I'm here at Osler Health International. Dr Neil Forrest, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me back.
We are today talking about burnout, and we all know that we're all having tough times at the moment. It's not easy on anyone. There are lots of factors that we're all struggling with and dealing with. Today we're talking about burnout, which we're going to go into exactly what that means, but it can be about working, it can be about family life, it can just be about being on a conveyor belt, which we all are, without breaks and rests and holidays. Dr. Neil, what is burnout? Let's start at the beginning.
Yeah, let's start there, because it's a term that we all use day to day, isn't it?
Yes.
It is also a recognised medical condition.
Right.
So it's worth defining. At its core, it's a syndrome of symptoms that result from chronic stress which hasn't been managed properly.
Right.
So it's not stress, but it's the result of lots and lots of stress that has been stacked up on itself and not been dealt with effectively. As far as the World Health Organization goes, in its definition of burnout as a condition, that relates to workplace stress only. So officially the definition is around employment in the workplace. As I was saying to you when we were chatting just before, I certainly see in my patients the burnout syndrome in other contexts outside of work. So I see people who don't work who are still burnt out.
Yeah.
Burnt out from family, from expat life, from the pandemic.
Yeah.
I see kids that are burnt out at school. So although it has this quite narrow WHO definition, I think it's something that as doctors we recognise in a much broader context.
So it's a cumulative effect. It's that stacking up, that piling up of everything just being too much.
Yeah, so lots of us have stressful jobs, lots of us have stressful days in our lives. That doesn't necessarily result in burnout, either if the stress goes away by itself, because it was a finite situation, or if we deal with the stress effectively, then we don't get burnt out. So burnout is what happens when that goes wrong.
Yeah. So how do you know when it's gone wrong and you are burnt out? How do you know when you've reached that point? Because like you said, we all have bad days, we all feel a bit rubbish sometimes, but how do you know when you've got to that extreme?
Okay, well again, if we start with the official sort of definition and then I'll work on to the way I would describe it. The WHO talks about the first sign being energy depletion or exhaustion. So tiredness is often the first presenting sign.
Right.
Now that's tricky because there are lots of people who feel tired for a whole bunch of reasons. Increasing mental distance from your role, I'm going to say role instead of job, so let's say that could be family or school or something else. So this feeling of sort of disconnection. And then the final stage is reduced efficacy, so you become less good at your job or your role. So we'll talk a little bit later about recognising that in friends and colleagues, but it can look from the outside like someone's just stopped caring or stopped being committed to their job, which is often not the case. I would describe it, in sort of more relaxed terms. You're right, we all feel stressed sometimes, but when the stressful days start to outnumber the non-stressful days, when you start to feel like you wish you were anywhere but where you are right now, then those are signs that you're going down that slope towards burnout.
Yeah, you're stopping enjoying what you're doing, you don't feel that enthusiasm, that motivation. That sounds very similar to a kind of slide into depression. Is there a crossover there? What's the difference?
There's certainly overlap. And when we think about the consequences of burnout, which are many, depression and anxiety are definitely two of the potential stopping off points along the way. The difference, I would say, fundamentally between burnout and depression is that burnout is situation specific.
Right.
Depression is a more broad term. So lots of people, the majority of people I would say, who I see who are depressed depressed for a whole host of reasons, or depressed and they don't know why they're depressed. And I know we've done a mental health channel, so I'm not going to get into depression. But what I would say from a burnout perspective is the solutions are normally more obvious in burnout. Sometimes more straightforward, which is nice. And some of the treatments we use for depression, like antidepressants, for example, really aren't. It's questionable how much we should be using them in depression. We really shouldn't be using them for things like that. It's not going to be the solution to the problem. So, whilst they might look and feel the same at times, most people who I see who are burnt out, for example, if they go on holiday, don't feel burnt out on holiday. Lots of people who are depressed, they're depressed wherever they are.
Yes.
And so there is this difference.
So would you say burnout is more temporary?
I would hopefully, if it's managed properly. I mean, we obviously we aim for that with depression as well. But I would say that it's a more compact and isolated problem if you look at the scope of someone's life.
And so how would you know? Like you said it's a collection of symptoms. What are those symptoms? How do you recognise it in yourself and in those around you?
So if we start with recognising it in yourself, because it might feel very different to you than how it looks to other people, particularly colleagues, I think, if we're talking about the workplace. So when I see people with burnout and ask them how they're feeling, there are psychological symptoms, so fatigue, interrupted sleep, lack of motivation, social withdrawals. People often stop showing up to meetings and events unless they really have to be there, unless it's mandated. They go out to weekends and do the things they used to do.
That lack of enthusiasm.
So that spreads into maybe other aspects of the life. I often see people demonstrating what we call an escapist mentality. So they get this really, I just want to walk away from it all. I go and live on a desert island somewhere, and I'm just done with. It's not this workplace; it's all workplaces. We all recognise that, right? I mean, I used to. I often tell patients the story when I was working in London. I was doing surgical training and working blocks of 7 or 10 nights in a row, 13-hour night shifts, and it would start to cause burnout by the end of that round of shifts. And I'd be walking through the hospital at 4 or 5 a.m. and I'd see the guy cleaning the floor on the sort of motorised floor polisher. And I used to think, I'd give anything right now to be the floor polisher guy, because he's just going to polish that floor and then he's done. And he's going to walk out and all the stress is gone. And of course that was ludicrous. He'd have probably given anything to swap places with me. But there's this, you see this feeling and that can lead people to make quite erratic decisions.
I'm sure.
And quite career or family threatening decisions in these sort of extremes of emotion. On the physical side, headaches, often gastric symptoms in people. The brain and the bowel are quite intimately linked, and so you see people with sort of chronic diarrhea or gastritis, inflammation in the stomach. And then the sort of the mental fatigue can lead on to quite reduced cognitive performance, so people become forgetful. Older patients sometimes think that they're developing dementia, and they say, I have to write everything down. I forget about meetings, or I come out of a meeting and I can't remember what anyone said. So the symptoms vary from person to person, and I think men and women can present quite differently as well. And they often become sort of more aggressive, and it's sort of a defense mechanism. And so you'll hear, they'll say, I'm blowing up at people at work, I'm shouting at people, and that's just not me. And that can be very counterproductive, because people don't want to help you if you're being unpleasant to them.
Of course.
And so I think symptoms are wide ranging, but those are some of the common things that we see.
And as you're going through that checklist, I'm doing a mental tick list, and because as we were chatting before, I personally had an episode of burnout last week after a really, really hectic week at work with family responsibilities, and I experienced many of those things. Brain fog, it was so real, and if you can't perform, you feel you're not good at something, you're not achieving something, it snowballs and it makes things much worse. You feel you're not good at your job, you don't want to do it anymore if you're no good at it, and then you become anxious because you're not achieving anything, you're not getting anywhere. So it can really, and I did actually have those escapist thoughts, which is ludicrous because I love what I do. And that actually was a bit of an alarm bell for me to say, okay, there's something, like, why am I not making any headway here? There's something really not right. So what should you do when you're feeling that way? Or you recognize it, but you don't know who to go to or how to share that and explain that.
Well, I would say it depends on what stage you're at.
Okay.
So, to use your experience last week as an example, you recognized it early on in the process.
Yeah.
And I don't know what you did to manage it yourself, but at that stage, self-management is quite feasible. You might not need to ask for any sort of outside or professional help.
I did ask for help, actually. I asked my lovely SSEW Business Women's Group, has anyone experienced this? I just feel like I'm not making any headway, my brain's in a complete fog, and I just feel rubbish. How do you get yourself out of this headspace? And I got so many amazing replies. Lots of people saying, be good to yourself, step away, do something good that you want to, that you feel will recharge you and replenish you. So yes, I think it was very early stages.
Yes.
But even then, I didn't really recognise it was burnout. I just like didn't know what was going on.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to try and establish is the situation that is causing burnout temporary, or is it permanent as things stand? If it's temporary, then recognizing that is so, and taking measures like you did, so stepping away, having a little break, focusing on exercise or family things or whatever it is that allows you. We all have our own different coping mechanisms of stress and things in our life that give it value and meaning.
Yes.
I think sometimes meditating on the fact of why are you doing what you're doing, and what are the why do you love the job you do and the role you do, and returning to that. So that's all fine in the early stages, or in a temporary situation, which you think, well, at the end of this week things are going to get better.
Right.
Then I think we've all been there. I think if it's more insidious than that, if it's been going on for a long time, or you're in a role or a situation that isn't looking like it's going to change without you doing something about it, then that can be more challenging. We know that there are certain, if we bring it back to jobs, but you can apply this to other elements of your life, there are certain risk factors. So we see burnout in certain situations. Helping professions is one. So healthcare workers, people who are working in NGOs, that kind of thing, seem to get more burnt out. The research says so. And it's something about the emotional toll of those jobs. People who work long or unusual hours get more burnt out. So it's easier to manage burnout 9 till 5. It's not perfect, but if you're working across time zones, that kind of thing, that can be stressful. Not having control, a big risk factor seems to be not having control over your day or your work, or so having more input into what you're doing day to day is protective. I see lots of people who have worked in a big corporate environment go to work for a startup where there's no defined roles. You might be the HR person, the accounts person, this development role, and that can be really invigorating. And it's high risk and high reward. But a lot of those people start to get burnt out because they have no control over the volume or the type of work they're doing, and there's never an end in sight. There's always at the end of the day.
They've got to do it all.
Yeah. So in people in these more long-term situations, it's about working with them to try and change either their own approach and culture and mentality, or more often that of their employer or their workplace.
Yeah.
So
Put some structure in, so that they can make some balance, make some time out. So how can a doctor help? Why should we come and see a GP about this?
It's a good question. You don't have to, but lots of people do. I think the reasons, the various reasons that people come and see me, and sometimes people come and see me because they're worried about someone else. They just want to ask for advice. But when people come for themselves, sometimes they don't know what it is. So they might have some of these physical symptoms, and is there something else going on?
Yeah.
They might have questions like, is this depression or is this burnout? Particularly in the expat community, they might not have someone close enough to them that they can turn to for support. And speaking to someone confidentiality who's outside of the home and the work situation. Sometimes people might take on it, and I think sometimes just offloading this stuff can be therapeutic in itself. We might achieve something in that first appointment, but somebody just wants to say, this is all the stuff I'm going through and I can't tell anyone else about it. Sometimes I will give people a time away. I might say, look, you need a week off, and here's a medical certificate. So we estimate that in the UK, where I'm from, around half of medical sickness days are related to burnout and stress.
Really? Half? That's incredible.
And I can't see any reason why Singapore wouldn't be the same. So now that's not the answer. You can't run away from the situation. But I think particularly with the pandemic, people aren't taking holidays like they used to. They're saving days up. They're hoping that travel comes back online. What's the point of being off if I can't go anywhere or do anything? And people need a break. Also, as we've talked about, I think the last time we spoke, bringing the office home is, it's great, it's flexible, you see the family more, but it can also be deeply unhealthy to not have that work-home separation. And that probably exacerbates the situation as well. So I can make the kind of suggestions I've made to you. I can give, sometimes, mandate that people's employer give them a break. I can point them in the direction of other resources, so we've got some good online resources. We work with different psychologists and therapists. Sometimes that can be helpful. Certain types of therapy, behavioural therapies, that teach you to approach challenges at work in different ways. Careers coaching sometimes. So sometimes your job is so toxic that there's no rectifying it and you need to find a different job. So you might need some help with preparing for that transition.
And sometimes when you're so deep in it, you don't even realise that yourself until you speak to somebody about the bigger picture.
It's a big thing for me to say to someone, but there have been occasions where I've said to people, I think you should walk away from this job. And sometimes they're incredibly high-powered jobs, and people have spent a lifetime building up to these jobs, and it can be tough to hear. And of course, it's always your decision. And I don't say that lightly, but sometimes people, the situations become so dire that people need a whole new change, and so we can help with that transition as well. So again, you absolutely don't have to or need to see a GP, but if you feel like you need some help, then
it's a good place to start.
It's a conversation I have a lot. So sometimes just speaking to someone who's witnessed the process before can be incredibly helpful.
And also, like you said, some of the symptoms might be related to other things, but they may be physical and not just mental, or a combination of everything. So to get a doctor's approach on that is useful.
Absolutely, and sometimes I might, we'll run some tests and I'll say to someone, you're not burnt out, you're terribly anemic. You've got hypothyroidism.
Which is useful to know also.
We fix that problem and the burnout goes away. So often these physical symptoms are psychosomatic, but by no means always. And so some people want the reassurance that this relentless fatigue that they're suffering isn't the result of a hormone deficiency or another medical condition that they should be focusing on.
Yeah, that's important. So where's the tipping point? We started by saying we all have rubbish days, and we know like what the symptoms are and how we'll be feeling when we get to that extreme. But when do you know when is the right time to reach out for help? When do you make an appointment?
I think the first thing that people should do if they recognise some of these symptoms in themselves or a friend or colleague is to do what you did last week, and what we talked about is try and try and look after yourself, self-care, get some sleep, stop relying so much on alcohol, do some exercise, common sense things, take a holiday. So I think when you should ask for help is if that's not working,
right?
And your usual sort of coping mechanisms have deserted you. I think the pandemic doesn't help with that, because a lot of my patients, the things they do to disconnect and relax are socialise with friends, team sports for a lot of them, and travel. And those three things have been taken away, along with a bunch of other things, whether it's singing in a choir or playing in an orchestra or whatever. So I think probably the reason we've seen more burnout in the last 2 years is that people have had these, to use a COVID phrase, circuit breakers, which they've had built into their lives, where they de-stress, just taken away from them.
Yes, correct. So step back, try and rebalance. And it does take effort to do that when those opportunities aren't there. So perhaps find something that you haven't tried before, or try and reframe.
Yeah, and I think that's where communities like yours can help. Where you say to people, look, this is how I'm feeling. Does anyone else feel like that?
Yes.
What should we do about it? Because a problem shared and all that, as the phrase goes. So. I think we talked a lot about what you can do for yourself, but I think being the person, asking people if they're okay, looking out for the signs in friends or colleagues. I think recognizing the fact that if you work with someone and they were previously doing quite well and they've suddenly become really bad at their job, that's weird, that's unusual. People don't lose abilities that they once had that easily. So if someone was once good at their job and now they're not performing well, ask yourself why that might be. It's probably not because they don't care anymore. It's probably because something else is going on. And I think if you run a company or a workplace, or you have any influence in your family or your job or your team or whatever it is, try and put structures in place where people have more say in their role. People are allowed to take breaks, and the importance of some social connections and time outside work is recognised. Have a robust system in place for recognising bullying and workplace relationship difficulties, and take those complaints seriously. Because a lot of people that I see are burnt out, there's nothing wrong with them. The problem is with someone else in their workplace, a toxic or a destructive personality. And so I think if some of us might not be feeling burnt out, but we might have the power to improve things for people who are.
That's very valid. Thank you. Lots of really, really great tips. And there's a fact sheet as well with a lot of these tips and resources, for which we're going to put in the comments underneath this post. Thank you so much for talking to us today. It's really important in these times. Thank you. Really, really appreciate that.
Anytime. Thanks very much for having me on.
Thank you, Wise Tribe. We'll see you on the next time.